and welcome to the Real God for Real People podcast. I'm with my big bro, Pastor Greg. He's going to be giving us just some insights from a ministry standpoint and pastoral standpoint on how sometimes we can struggle with understanding how God both interacts with sin or evil actions in the world, as well as like how do we understand his love for us through that. So, Pastor Greg, you want to say anything to the people?
Man, I'm just excited to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Hey, let's go. All right, cool. So, we're just going to kind of start off with, hey, where does, from a biblical standpoint, evil actually come from your take, Pastor Greg?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because a couple of things that we always talk about is that God created everything, if he is all powerful. And as a matter of fact, we talk about how the Hebrew verb to create is only used with God as the subject. Yeah. So if you walk that logically, you could say God created evil. But I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what evil is. Evil is not a thing in and of itself. It is, two ways historically we've looked at evil in the Christian orthodoxy. One is that evil is the absence of good. Yeah. So you remove God from a person, a conversation, a culture, a situation, an action, and then it is devoid of the good, and we call that void evil. So that's that. And the other kind of way to look at evil is that it is a perversion of the good. So God created everything on this planet for good. Yep. And we can, as moral agents, choose to use that for bad. So you and I, the example I always use, you and I could drive to Kentucky and go to Louisville and go to the Louisville Slugger baseball bat factory. Yep. And we could each buy a brand new baseball bat. And you can go to the ballpark and you can crank out home runs and knock them out of the park. Yep. And I can go to the Walmart parking lot and bash windshields. Yeah. So are we going to blame the Louisville bat manufacturer because I did that? No, the bat was good, or at minimum morally neutral. And then my moral actions then added to that and do that. So that's how evil can work. So you remove God, evil is that void, or you take what God made for good and you use it for a different purpose.
Man, that's good. And like if I hear you correctly, it seems like more of the evil is actually out of the absence of God's presence in our actions.
100%. I think so. I mean, think about the original temptation. Yep. Now, do we think that God put the knowledge of good and evil in a specific fruit on a specific tree? Personally, I don't think so. Yeah. I think God just gave the category of, hey, literally everything you do is cool. Yep. Like you can do whatever you want. Yep. Except this one thing. And I don't think it was that the tree was bad. And, it wasn't that God was trying to keep something. There's a movement right now within atheists to say that God was trying to keep knowledge from us. I said, no, it's the knowledge of good and evil. It's experiential knowledge. That's it. It's not theological. It's not academic knowledge. Nope. It's that experience. Like I know now what evil is. Yep. And so I personally don't think there was anything unique about the tree, that this tree was evil. It was just God drew a line in the sand. He's like, don't cross this line. And where did they go? That's a good looking line. Yep. I bet there's something on the other line.
It's gotta be.
Yeah, 100%.
Like even with my students, what I'll tell them on a regular basis is somehow you don't have the urge to not do something until someone tells you not to do it.
Well, Paul says that in Romans, he comes in and there's this misunderstanding that God gave us the law to make us good. And Paul's like, actually, the law multiplies sin. Yeah. The law puts a magnifying glass on our sin. So we should respond and be like, I'm not good enough.
Yep. Yeah. No, man. Okay. So then if we start understanding evil as a concept of the results of most likely choice, and our choice to now be our own gods and make our own decisions.
Big picture. I want to say big picture, not that I'm experiencing a evil in my life and it's somehow direct punishment for a bad choice I
Yep.
made. And we can talk about that in a minute.
Yep.
But yeah, so how did evil come to exist?
Mhm.
Because moral agents made a choice.
That's it.
And we can blame the devil.
Mhm.
We can blame Adam and Eve. Sorry, fellas. God says Adam committed the first sin,
Yep.
not Eve.
Yep.
And the reality is yes, they made a choice for sin, but we're not innocent. Every single person besides Christ has continually made the same choice. Yeah.
Every day. No,
Oh, yeah.
that's it. So then if we're talking through choices and we're talking through the effects of those choices, and even that being, hey, now for high picture, now evil's in the world, sin is in the world. How do we completely think through or talk through how God both understands the effects of evil on others, and as well as how God relates to our suffering because of the effects of being in a broken world?
Yeah, well, so God is both immanent and transcendent, which
Mhm.
means he is here and then here and now.
Mhm.
He knows, through Christ as flesh and blood, he
Mhm.
knows by the Spirit dwelling in every believer, by
Yep.
his omnipresence. He's here.
Mhm.
He's also transcendent. He is totally different than us.
Yep.
So while he can relate 100% to us,
Mhm.
because Jesus, he created us, he
Mhm.
designed us,
Mhm.
Jesus was a man,
Yep.
we can't relate fully to God.
No.
He's above us. His ways are not our ways.
Yep.
His thoughts are not our thoughts.
Yep.
So he comes in, and so he understands sin from an academic perspective,
Yep.
a theological perspective.
Yep.
He understands it from an experiential, not that he committed evil,
Mhm.
but he's had the evil committed against him.
Yep.
As far as, think about David.
Mhm.
David, killed a dude. Well, first of all, cheated on the dude's wife,
Yep.
got her pregnant,
Yep.
killed him,
Yep.
didn't even recognize it was sin. Nathan comes out and be like, hey, some dude killed a sheep.
Uh-huh.
And David's like, let's get him.
We'll kill him right now, today.
And Nathan's like, you're the man. And what was David's response? God, against you
Uh-huh.
and you only
Uh-huh.
have I sinned.
Yep.
And I'm like, Uriah's in the grave going, hey, wait a second, man. Like,
Wait a minute. So I ain't had nothing to do with this?
yeah,
Oh, okay.
so his sin affected him, but we can't sin against other people because
Yeah.
we're not breaking people's commands.
Mm.
They're God's commands. So
Mhm.
so he experiences evil committed against him, and
Mhm.
then Christ experienced evil uniquely in that he walked in an evil world.
Mhm.
Like he felt the effects of sin on the human body. Not that
Yep.
he committed sin,
Yep.
but he felt like what it was like to scrape his knee.
Yep.
He felt like what it was like to age,
Mhm.
and even though, he only made it to his early 30s,
Mhm.
and the early 30s aren't that old, Sean.
I don't know. I don't care what Greg says. Everything hurts, y'all. Everything
Yeah.
hurts.
But he was rejected,
Yeah.
he was spat on, he
Yep.
was beat, and ultimately he was crucified. And that's why Hebrews tells us we have a high priest who understands, who can sympathize with
Mhm.
us. And so he faced temptation.
Yep.
He faced temptation to worship something besides God. He
Yep.
faced temptation to set aside the great work of the kingdom for something that was good, but not God's plan.
Mhm.
So God understands that, and God does intervene.
Mhm.
It's just we see from a very, very limited perspective.
I think that's it. Where I think the old phrase when I grew up, because I always love using some of the old deacons phrases, is hey, one, live a little bit longer, and then two, it's closer to that text where our ways aren't his ways.
Yeah, well, we look at,
Yeah.
let's take big picture stuff. Look
Mhm.
at the Holocaust.
Yep.
Did God have the power to stop that?
Sure.
Absolutely, he did.
Mhm.
Did he allow it to happen?
Mhm.
Absolutely did.
Mhm.
Did he cause it to happen? Absolutely not. Is he morally culpable now because he allowed it to happen?
Mhm.
Absolutely not.
Mhm.
And so that there's a couple of things going on there. One, we don't see all the ways that God intervenes.
Yep.
We don't see all the evil he holds back and the ways that he stops. We're blissfully unaware sometimes of the dangers around. Well, it's just like being a little kid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're with your parents, and you're with your dad, you're with your mom, you're with your grandparents, whoever, and there are dangers around you sometimes that those adults are actively protecting you from.
And you ain't trying to hear it.
And you just blissfully unaware.
Yep.
Or you're whining about something minor.
Yep.
You know, your parents might be a 3-year-old, and your parents are going through marital issues, financial issues, health issues, and you're upset because the juice box is 6 inches away.
And that would be my son. Not all the other stuff, but the juice box.
Yeah, absolutely. Why? Because they're unaware of the bigger picture. And I think I said it Sunday, and I was copying it for somebody else because Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. The difference between a toddler and an adult is infinitely smaller than the difference between the most spiritually mature adult and God.
That's true.
So a lot of it's our perspective. So we can look around this world and like, but God, you let this bad and this bad and this bad happen. One of the categories we have to acknowledge is we don't know all the things that God did stop.
Yeah.
So, and then part of it too is God is not limited by power or strength. God is limited by his character.
Yeah.
So God can't do anything. God cannot sin. God cannot lie. God cannot commit injustice. And I think one of the differences that most people don't understand with is if you hurt my feelings, Shad, if you do something against me, what does God call me to do? To forgive you. Am I like, Shad, I'll forgive you if there's a blood sacrifice? No, that would be inappropriate. But I am an equal to you. We are neighbors. God is not our neighbor. He's our judge. And so for the only way for him to destroy all evil is to destroy sin. And in order to do that, he would have to destroy anyone who's associated with sin.
Which would be all of us.
Which would be everybody. You know, and it is. It's just like that. I can't remember what song it was, but Lecrae had a lyric. And it's like, if life was fair, we'd all be in hell tonight. And I was like, I don't like that one. That hurts. But it's true. It is. And so part of it is, you know, and the thing, you know, Peter talks about it. Well, you know, God is not weak or slow. He is long suffering, and he is giving us every opportunity as individuals, as peoples, as a human race to repent and turn to him. Because once he says enough is enough, I am good, I am just, I am righteous, I am going to condemn and destroy evil. Everybody who has chosen to align themselves with evil, which, like you said, is everybody outside of those who are now cleansed from that in Christ, get destroyed too. So most people who are arguing like, if God were really good, he'd get rid of evil, are the people who God would have to get rid of. And it's usually other people's evil. That's
it's never ours.
Oh no, and that's the other problem with sin is we see other people sin. And we don't recognize that. And part of that comes into the whole debate over, you know, God's sovereignty versus free will.
And my thing is always, and this is where my big bro Greg can help me. When I went to seminary, it was to understand and be able to study and have the conversation. It was never to be right, because I understand, one, there's time frames where interpretation can be debated.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, and then there's other situations where it is, man, we are not going to fully understand this concept until we get to heaven.
No, absolutely.
And the greatest thing one of my philosophy teachers told me is he got comfortable as he went up his PhD route with being okay with certain levels of uncertainty.
Absolutely.
And I think when it even comes to evil, like one of the illustrations that most pastors hate, but it actually helped me understand the choice we're asking God to make, was the shed. And I bet you already know what scene I'm thinking about, but there's this scene where the quote unquote supposed to be Holy Spirit is telling, so you choose.
Okay.
And she's like, one child or the other.
Okay.
And he's like, no, take me. And essentially they're going through this, they're going back and forth. He's like, no, neither, take me.
Okay.
And though the narrative with the shed is whatever you want to see on it, I don't never articulate it to be biblical.
Heresy. Sorry.
I mean, he couldn't help it. I knew he was going to. It took him longer than I thought, y'all, to be honest. But the overarching concept
there are
was like,
people from that. I'm not going to argue.
You know, it's where, man, we want God to choose someone else's sin to be more evil.
Oh, absolutely.
Than mine.
Well, there's
you know.
gradation of sin in
Mhm.
one sense
Sure.
because there's different punishments.
Sure.
You know, in the Old Testament, there were capital punishments, there
Mhm.
were fines you'd pay, there were things of that nature.
Yeah.
But then there's also the perspective from God that all sin is open rebellion against Him.
God. Yep.
You know, so I think the metaphor I like for that is like New York City.
Mhm.
If you're walking the streets and you look around, man, there's some really tall buildings, medium buildings, small buildings. Like your perspective changes. But if you look from outer space or a satellite and you look down, all the buildings are the same. They're all buildings. So sometimes from our perspective, man, this sin is so much worse than this sin. From God's perspective, it's like, yeah, there's consequences and there's all these things, but ultimately, from His perspective, is still disrespect, rebellion, open choices that basically what sin is when we look at God and go, we're smarter than you, God. Like you're cool and stuff, but my ways are higher than your ways. And that's what makes sin so terrible.
But I think where folks may struggle at times is not, at least maybe in some of the church circles, is not understanding like how evil works or how sin works, but really understanding kind of like Mary when she's mad with Jesus because he didn't come to save her brother in time. Or it might have been Martha. You get me right.
Yeah, I got you.
And he gets there and now she's like, if you would have been here, he would have been alive. I think sometimes we struggle with the idea that because of sin now and because of the effects of sin on creation, like we do go and leave this earth sometime without clear understanding or explanation as to why. And we feel as though we're owed that.
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. One, if God gave us the why, it'd be like us. It'd be like a physicist explaining his understanding of the universe to a toddler. And we'd be like, stars are pretty, you know? like there's so, I can't begin to understand how everything is so connected. And not that we're going to go into like the butterfly effect or anything like that, but it's, you know, sometimes we'll be like, you know, the weather's a certain way. Like we're having a church event and it was supposed to rain, but the weather comes and we're like, gotta change the weather for our event. I'm like, dude, there's a lot more at play here. Can't God do that? Yeah. So part of it is that. And I think, well, the one big thing we have to recognize with this conversation is there's two tones to talking about this.
Yeah.
There's a tone of the person who just tragically lost someone.
Sure.
And that's not the time to have an academic theological discussion. Like I remember a debate one time and it was Christian versus an atheist and they had a Q&A and one of the people in the audience asked the Christian, is like, why did God create cancer? And the guy gave a biological theological explanation for that. And this person was just hurting.
That's it.
And it was the wrong environment for her question, and I get that, but it doesn't matter. At that point, a person isn't looking for that. You know, they're not looking to have a conversation, a dialogue. Hey, I'm really concerned about the theological implications of biology and evil. No, they're like, God, you know, people, I'm hurting.
Yeah.
And there's a time to minister to them and love them and not argue. God's a big God. He doesn't need us to defend him.
That's it.
And that's one of the issues with certain strands of Christianity, different world religions, where it's like you're not allowed to ask questions about God or question things. You'll get the sword because how dare you? I have to protect God's honor. No, it's I have to again check my heart, make sure I'm honoring God, but yeah. So at some point, this isn't the right conversation. The way we're talking about it here is not the same way you're going to talk about it when you walk into somebody's house. I had a pastor, one of my professors actually, talk about it, had a tragic death in his church. A man in his 30s who died accident, completely, you know, no warning, left behind a wife, couple of kids, and he went to the house and stayed there for several hours as different people came in and out. And it felt like he never had the words to say. Did the funeral, went on, continued to minister to this woman. About 2 weeks to a month later, she came back and said, hey, you just being there was
That's
the
it.
greatest gift that day.
That's it.
Now, he could have sat down and said, well, there's evil in the world, and sometimes we live in a world and there's gratuitous evil,
Yep.
or we could say, God's going to use the death of your husband to bless somebody.
I know some folks that done that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And can God? Yes. Am I the great articulator of why God does what he does? Like, don't be a Pat Robertson. You know, I said I won't call nobody out. Oh, Pat.
No.
You know,
Pat,
I remember,
we love you. I don't even know.
Yeah. If you're listening to this, no, I remember when Katrina hit,
Yeah.
you know, and he was like, "This is a judgment on the sin of New Orleans." I was like, "You don't know that," and
that's the key.
Yeah, absolutely. Or when was it the late '90s, early 2000s, a tsunami hit South Asia.
Yep.
And some people are like, God caused the tsunami to happen so Christian Relief could go in there and do mission work. I'm like, you don't know that. So God can bring good out of evil without causing the evil.
That's it.
And that's we got to be very careful because what that looks like, and the big fancy word for that is theodicy. Like, how do you explain how God uses evil? And one of my professors and my philosophy professor in seminary is very helpful with that. Is just evil exists.
That's it.
Bad things happen because we live in a bad world.
Yep.
And God brings good out of everything. So why should bad be
any different?
Yeah, God's not like, oh, I had great plans, but
bad done messed it up.
Yeah.
No, I think, and we might be trailing a little bit, but I think it's a great conversation for us. I think sometimes from a ministerial standpoint, especially, and you can speak from the pastoral spot, there's an urge to always have an answer.
I think the younger I was, there was that urge. And I think there's two things that have happened for me personally. One, I've been on an academic theological journey where my eyes were open to how little I knew. You know, you finish your MDiv and you've learned so much theology, so much Bible, so much counseling, so much preaching in 3 years, and you come out and you're like, I'm taking on hell with a squirt pistol.
That's our best friend favorite phrase.
Yeah. But then and it doesn't have to be a PhD, but as you study the Bible and get deeper into it, and you get deeper into theology and church history and all these things, and you're like, I don't know that much. And there's so much more to it. And, you know, I think there just has to be a humility that comes. And honestly, what happened to me a couple of times, especially when I was younger in student ministry, because teenagers ask tough questions.
Yes, they do.
They don't have a filter sometimes like adults do. I would build an answer in the spot, in the moment, and I would crash and burn. And I was like, there's probably, I can say, hey, I don't know.
Yep.
I've never thought about that fully, or, you know, I don't have a full understanding of that. Let me think about it. Let's get together for coffee next week and let's talk about that.
Greatest thing my philosophy,
absolutely.
It was theology teacher told me, and now he's, I won't blast him too much, but he's a president at one of the seminaries. It is being okay not knowing the answer.
Absolutely.
But hey, I'll go, and being faithful enough to come back.
I think that shows the person you're talking to real humility. It shows the reality of, well, I mean, there's a natural temptation to elevate pastors, professors, all that. Like they're special. I used to think pastors were special, and then I became one. And there's no secret handshake. We don't have, an order behind a magic door that teaches all these things. We're just sinful people who have opportunities to get education seminary, to spend time in vocational ministry, and I'm grateful for that. But there has to come some humility with that. And the cool thing for me is I was able to be around, and I am still around men and women who model that well. You know, if you grow up with that pressure to always know the answer, you're always going to have an answer. It might be a wrong one or a smart one. But
and I think too, it's one of the things where it's a president deal. If we aren't careful, pastor, director, whatever leadership role you play, if you aren't careful of always having an answer, then you create almost this dependency from the people you serve. that
Oh,
they don't
absolutely.
look for themselves before they
Nope.
even ask the question.
And then there's questions where you'll never have an answer.
Nope.
And the Bible does not tell us. And you just got to say, if God had wanted us to know, he would have told us, but he
Yep.
didn't.
That's
So that's
it.
okay. And a lot of it, at least what I found, it's distraction
Yep.
from the goal of
Yep.
love God, love people,
Make
make disciples. Well, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? Who cares? When was the last time you talked to somebody about Jesus? Like that's part of it too. But we're getting off the subject.
No, you're good. You're good. So
Surprise, you get a Baptist preacher on a podcast and he goes off subject.
I kind of expected. I don't even think that's just a Baptist thing anymore.
No, it's just people.
So as we break down and talk through the concept of God's will and free will, can you give us an understanding of, from a biblical standpoint, what is free will?
Yeah, great question. So if you go to a concordance or you go to Google and you look for the phrase free will, you're not going to find it.
Yep.
So it's like the word theology. It's like the word Trinity. It's like the word rapture.
Yep.
Doesn't mean that the word doesn't show up in the Bible. Doesn't mean it's not there. It's a word to describe a biblical principle.
Yep.
Some of that is taught. Some of that is just logical conclusions of what God has done. My philosophy professor in seminary actually didn't like the phrase free will. He liked the phrase moral responsibility. Because in one sense, our will is not free. Our will is bound by physical limitations, mental limitations. Now we're bound by sinful limitations.
Yeah.
So our will isn't free. And we find this. Well, Romans 7, Paul says he had a will. The things that I know I should do, I fail to. The things I know I shouldn't do, I fall into.
Yep.
So his will, it's not free. So I think sometimes that so let's talk about moral responsibility. God created us as moral agents. We make choices. We're not biological machines, which is a rapidly growing concept in the secular world, that, to acknowledge a spirit or soul is to acknowledge supernatural, and we reject that.
Yeah.
So why do we appear to love, to hate, to make choice?
Yep.
Well, it all is just biological responses.
It's a chemical response, and therefore
absolutely.
you just figure out how the chemicals mesh together and you can repeat the response.
Yeah. And so obviously our bodies and our souls biblically are connected. So some of that is true. Some of that is our reactions. Like being hangry is real.
Yeah.
Like it's a physical reaction that affects our soul. But God created us to make choices. And so we have a moral responsibility. We're moral agents. We make choices. So the option is, if God didn't create us that way, then we're not held accountable. Then I am just biological. So if I just randomly kill somebody, I'm not bad or evil. That's just how I was wired. Oops. That's if you take that. Part of the problem with theology, philosophy, ideas is we don't take them to their logical conclusion.
Yeah.
And so if we take an idea, we like an idea because it's an overreaction to an idea we don't like. So sometimes with free will, we overreact and we go the other way. And we're like, well, we're just this. Well, then there's no such thing as good.
Yep.
And there's no such thing as love. And there's no such thing as hate. We're just highly evolved animals. Which everybody knows we're not.
No.
Like I say all the time, if aliens land on the planet, they look around and be like, people are different.
Yep.
Like every other thing is like, I get this. And they always say, well, pigs are really smart, or dolphins are really smart. And I was like, has a dolphin built an Xbox? No. So they're not. Showed my level of maturity right there. But it is. So we do have this free will. And the problem is I have free will, and so do the other 7 billion dummies on the planet.
Yeah.
And their will and my will don't mesh. And we're not the main characters in our story.
But we think we are.
Oh my goodness. Well, we're always aware of our own perspective. When you watch a movie, read a book, you're always aware of the main character's perspective, so we feel like we're the main character. Problem is, this year they're expecting us to cross the 8 billion mark.
I thought that was soon.
There's going to be 8 billion people on the planet, and we're no more valuable than any of them. And so we look around and we're like, well, people just did this, or this person's choice. And then again, the math to calculate how 8 billion people's moral agent choices affect each other is above me.
Yep.
So we've got a moral responsibility. We have the ability to choose, but that ability to choose, so mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, has all been infected by sin.
Mm-hmm.
So sin is bad stuff we do, but it's also like a spiritual disease that we have, and that has polluted our will.
Yep.
So one, we don't even know. It's hard to know what the good thing is to do.
Yeah.
And then even if we do know it, it's almost impossible for us to do it on a consistent basis. Well, it is impossible for us to do it on a consistent basis.
Because the way I think of it is when Job is responding bad to God, or really God responding bad to Job, after God's like, I'm going to let you get this off your chest, and I'm going to speak. And he's literally saying, hey, where were you at when I created the universe and I divided the light from the day and the stars?
I don't remember you being on that committee.
It was like, so you think your will is able to size up with mine? Let me blow your mind for about 10 minutes. And then let's re-talk about this. And Job is speechless. But it is where, I think you spoke about it really well in the beginning. If we pull God outside of it and we're just dealing with evil at its essence, or sin producing evil at its essence, right? If he's not in it, everyone's right is right. And there really is no wrong because it's right in your own eyes.
Every atheistic ethical system falls apart at some point to create a good. Where do you get the good? So, and even monotheistic or religious systems can fall down. So there's this is where I get to quote somebody really smart and sound like I'm smart. So there's a philosophical issue in Greek philosophy called Euthyphro's dilemma. Euthyphro was a philosopher, and he was talking to, at this point I can't remember, it was Plato or Socrates, and he's like, where do the gods, Greek gods, at his point, it could apply to any god, any moral higher power, where does he get the good law? Okay, did he create it by sheer will? Well, if he just did it because he's the strongest, then he can change it, and he can come tomorrow and say, well, murder and theft and lying and adultery are good. It's just power, or a more powerful being comes along and changes that. Okay, well, that's not a good option. Well, did he discover the law? Is he just so smart and so above us that he discovered the law? Well, there's a problem with that too, because then the law is above him and he's not really God. And it stumped the Greeks. The Greeks were like, Paul comes on and he says, no, the law is a revelation of God's character. Well, if I say Paul, Moses did it and God did it, but I love the way Paul puts it in Romans, where he talks about in Romans 13, where it's like love is the fulfillment of the law. What does that mean? The law is to teach us how to love God and
So, as we stated before, if you have been blessed from what you've heard in this podcast or any of these podcast episodes, what we need from you is to like, share, follow, and subscribe. Once again, like, share, follow, and subscribe. If you do those 3 to 4 things, hey, you'll be able to help us get the word out about what the Lord's been showing us through just living life and studying his word. And then 2, you can also help us to get to a point where we can get the word out to more people. Man, I love you guys. Remember, you can also follow us on Preacher Man S. And the title will be Preacher Man S on Instagram. You can follow us there. And you can also find our podcast on most major music platforms or podcast platforms like iHeartRadio, Spotify, or Apple Music. Y'all have a blessed one, and I can't wait to jump back into this next week. Talk to you soon.